Good morning and welcome to the Point. This week in Lansing, there was a breakthrough of sorts. As you know, the budget process has been slowed because legislators wanted a new teacher retirement system, something Governor Rick Snyder had been resisting. But sometime this past week, they all sat down and came up with a deal. So much so that both the House and Senate passed identical language on Thursday, and one of those chambers will have to vote on it again next week. Once they do, that should clear the way for the budget deal to get done and for the legislature to break for the summer. I sat down with the Senate Majority Leader, Meekhof, an Ottawa County Republican, to find out exactly how it all came together. Senator, we have come to a place that 2 weeks ago might have seen a far reach, at least from my observation standpoint. You and I didn't talk a whole lot on the island because there was so much going on up there, but at that point, the governor was kind of out of the loop, or at least it seemed as though he was when it came to budget discussions because of teacher retirement. Here we are, short 2 weeks later, and the teacher retirement issue, as you and I speak, has been dealt with in the Senate, and as the moment we're speaking, it's being voted on over in the House, and we presume it's going to pass over there. That's something you said that's been attempted here for a couple of decades.
Yeah, I think the last time it was attempted, they were a couple votes short in 1997, so 20 years ago. And we believe this is a more portable, modern system that's going to be even better for future teachers. It gives them portability if they don't want to continue to teach, but it gives them a better product, and it matches exactly what legislators get.
Democrats, many teachers, were here today, and they have voiced some considerable concerns that because of the way that this system is set up, a pension still exists within the retirement. We'll explain that
Correct.
in a minute, but it comes at quite a cost, a bigger cost for the people who want to take that. And they say that one of their arguments is that if you want to keep good people in the teaching system, that a good retirement is part of that. Do they have a point when it comes to changing the retirement?
Well, I would say also back in 1997 when the legislature turned over and went to a 401k versus the pension, we haven't had any trouble attracting people to run for the legislature. So if it's really the retirement that they're going into profession for, it's probably not the right choice that they're making.
How does this then change the pension formula? Right now, if I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it's a 401k pension hybrid for people in the system now. Is that true?
That is true. No, those will be closed to new entrants.
Okay, so those will continue.
Correct.
So
and nothing for them changes.
So this will be for new people coming into the system, presumably starting with the next school year.
I believe it starts this fall.
Okay. So if you come into the system now, if you're a teacher starting out now, you will go into a 401k system very much like many people in the private sector.
That's absolutely correct.
However, if you want a pension, the difference between the two, then you can opt into that, but then it's going to cost you more of a contribution.
Well, then there's more cost share inside of that, yes. But the state still must pay, constitutionally must pay their share.
So as it sits today, and I believe we anticipate all of this will be finalized next week, along with the budget, which we'll get to in a minute, the system will be changed first time in a long time.
In 20 years.
And this is something that you and the speaker really held firm on and had to work with the governor. Is this the kind of product you wanted at the end?
Yes, it is. I mean, we have, it's more stable, more secure, and we've actually made a very large down payment into the oldest part of the debt, another $200 million on top of the $1 billion, because we hadn't been managing pensions well and assumptions were not correct. And now we've said, all right, we're going to stop digging that hole. As you've heard me say, I think I said it to you on your program, when you're in the hole, you got to stop digging. And we stopped digging the hole and going forward a more secure, more stable retirement system for teachers.
What does that debt look like now?
Well, again, if you would have said 6 months ago when they were looking at it, they said it was $24 billion. And now when they looked at their assumptions and found out that they weren't correct, it was $29 billion. So overnight we gained $5 billion. So now we're stopping that. We're no longer going to add debt to that. But moving forward, we have to pay for the 401k and the matching, and we have to pay the debt. So we are constitutionally obligated to do that, and what we've just done is flattened out our debt and refinanced our debt so that we can afford to do all of that and our priorities that we wish to do in future budgets.
To put that in perspective, the budgets that I anticipate you will pass, that you will concur with after our conference, about $56 billion for the next fiscal year.
Correct.
So, well, more than half of a year's budget is what the liability is in those unfunded pensions.
Yes, if you had to pay it all today, correct.
All right, let's talk about the budget. The budget is something that for 6 years you and your colleagues have been proud to say, we've gotten this done by end of May, first part of June. And again, part of the conversation during the Detroit Regional Chambers conference on Mackinac was that, well, maybe that won't happen this year. In fact, in my conversation with the governor in the theater, I said, are you going to be able to get this budget done on time? And at that time, the whole idea of teacher retirement was still hovering out there. And he said it could be difficult to get it done by the end of June. Well, the estimate is now that you may be looking at 20th, 21st, somewhere in there maybe?
Yeah, sometime next week. If everything comes together, and it looks like it is, should be the middle to end of next week.
Tell me about spending priorities in the budget, because it is bigger by a couple $1 billion over the last fiscal spending. So what's in there? What will people see? What will they notice, or will they?
Well, not all people will notice, although what I just mentioned before, $1 billion into the teacher retirement, plus another $200 million payment. We'll also have prepaid the first 2 years of the new hybrid plan, so somewhere around $55 million. So those are really big numbers. Corrections, again, is a very large number. It's about $2 billion out of our budget, all general fund money. And Senator Prose and others have done some really good work to make sure that as we're decreasing the amount of prisoners there because they are not coming back in recidivism, that they have found ways to also use the money there to provide for programming for prisoners so that when they re-enter, they likely will not reoffend and come back. So we're reinvesting that to make sure that dollar and expense keeps going down.
That's one of the things we talked about with the senator a few weeks ago when we talked about some of that criminal justice reform, with the idea of keeping people out of prison, keeping those costs down. But it bears a reminder that that money, you said, all comes from the general fund, and people don't always get what that means. The general fund is $10 billion in that neighborhood. Billion, yeah. So that's 20% of all of what is really the discretionary money. And not all of that is discretionary, but what discretionary funds there are in that pot.
Yes.
So school aid fund for next year will be approximately how much?
If I have this correct, it's a little over $13 billion.
So about in the ballpark of where you have been spending, maybe?
Yeah, it's a little bit more because we did increase per pupil funding again.
So on balance, when you look at what you have been able to do with both changing the teacher retirement plan, which is something that, as I say, the legislature really drove that issue, and putting together a budget with some of the governor's priorities that he laid out earlier in the year and the priorities again from the legislature, obviously you as the Senate Majority Leader are going to be, I suspect, relatively pleased with this. Is this by and large a budget that you'll see some bipartisan support on?
I think we will, especially on the what we call them the omnibus when we pass out the general fund money, and the school aid, which we call the school bus, just for simple and ease of talking about it. I think there will be bipartisan support. It was very well laid out during committee process, and people had all their input and got their things together. And I think that's a really good work product for the legislature.
So people say, well, you just talked about maybe $10 billion in general fund and maybe 13, 14, almost $14 billion, but there's a whole lot of money left over. Talk about the rest of the budget, which is pretty much of it is federal pass-through money, right?
Most of it is federal pass-through money. I will remind your viewers it's their tax money that comes back to us, and usually with strings attached in terms of either education, transportation, or healthcare. And those three eat up most of the rest of it, given when we put up $1 for spending on a certain type of health care, we get 3 to 4, sometimes 5 back from the federal government of their dollars, not money that just gets printed at the White House. This is their dollars that have gone to Washington and come back to the state. So
when you think of things like Medicaid, for example, that's one of the big ticket items. And I don't want to get too far down this path because we don't know what they're going to do in Washington.
No, we don't.
But the Medicaid expansion that was done here in the state of Michigan, if Medicaid has changed dramatically in Washington, that could be, looking forward, that could be a money issue for the state, couldn't
Yeah,
it?
we are constantly monitoring what's going on with that, because the governor's been there and been invited to be part of a group to help give them ideas on how to do the things that could be best for states and people that need the health care. But the fiscal impact is very large if they would change something drastically, and then we would have to revisit what it is our budget consists.
And we are not alone. There are a lot of other states that
Right,
with
we are not
Medicaid
alone,
expansion.
correct.
So it will be an ongoing discussion. When you look at where we are now, the argument, and I guess it always makes news when people have a little bit of a dust up in Lansing. So the argument is about the teacher retirement cost, and everybody seemed, when I talked to you briefly on the island, you were pretty confident that you were going to work through this and bring it to some kind of a resolution. How difficult is it when Republicans are in control of everything in the state, but you can't, if the Republicans can't agree, that makes it difficult. How tough was it to pull that together?
It was difficult at first, but I think between the governor, speaker, and I, we were speaking the same language, but weren't arriving at the same conclusion. And as we continue to work together and the chemistry becomes better between all three of us, we found the places where everybody needed to land, and you just figure it out. We don't do that in public, obviously, but if you can work with somebody, which you don't agree on everything, but find the things you can agree on, and you just keep moving and keep working on the things, and I'm very proud of the work product of the speaker and the governor.
As I said at the top of the show, the budget will be voted on likely next week. That will be taken care of after the teacher retirement system is voted through one of the other chambers. There's a 5-day rule, a procedural thing that says you have to wait those 5 days on a new piece of legislation. And that's one of the holdups that they'll take care of next week. There's still much more to talk about when we come back to the point. Welcome back to the Point. We continue our conversation with Senate Majority Leader Arlen Meekhof. We talked with the senator about a number of subjects, including the ongoing problem with water and infrastructure in Flint, about term limits, and what about the prospect of a part-time legislature, and even coming to the end of his time in the Senate. The governor had asked for some money to more or less be set aside for Flint, for not specific, my recollection in his budget preview was that they wanted money to be there for unforeseen expenditures that are almost certainly going to happen. Is that money going to be in this budget?
We have put extra money in the infrastructure fund, so it's not necessarily said it's going to go to Flint, but there is money there. If we need to do something, there is money to do, available to do something.
So if all comes together the way it looks like it will, by the middle of next week, the major lift for the early part of the session, which is getting a budget done, will be done, and the summer in-district work period will begin. What is the agenda for the fall?
Well, for the fall, we still have local governments with OPEB issues, other post-employment benefits. We're quite heavy on acronyms, so we would try to explain that. Other post-employment benefits. So we have some significant challenges there. I do think Flint has some challenges yet, and we'll be working on some of those things. And I think there's, even after you're done with the budgets, you're not always done with the budget. You find something, or even with this teacher retirement, we may find a few more things that we need to work with ORS to make sure that everything moves along smoothly, and we do indeed secure that retirement for a long time going forward.
We talked about this before, but I kind of like to revisit a little bit. You talked about local municipalities and some of their retirement costs. Explain why that's the state's problem.
It really isn't. But at the end of the day, if a municipality has used the state's credit rating or bond rating to borrow against, it could be our responsibility. And we want to make sure that folks that are making commitments to employees going forward in the year know that they have to pay for them. And most communities are very responsible. So I would suspect that a number of them, I don't even know what percentage to say, are underfunded by a little bit, some underfunded by half, and some are underfunded and they don't know how they're going to get out of it. And we may have to find some tools to help them get out of that.
And in doing so, then I make the assumption that you would also try to make them apply best practices going forward. Is that the kind of thing that
would be some of it? And again, for whatever reason, we don't want to just disband communities or anything like that, but they also know that they have to be responsible for the decisions that folks have made there, and they have to own up to them.
You talk about Flint. Obviously, we've seen a lot of news with new charges from the Attorney General this past week. But one of the questions that I talked to your counterpart, Senator Ananick, about was, where are we with Flint? And obviously, he lives there and he sees it every week. And from the infrastructure standpoint, just getting the water right standpoint, it still seems like there is a heavy lift there. There's a long way to go with there. Are you, as the Senate Majority Leader and Speaker of the House and all your members, is it kind of baked in as you look for forward spending to know that the state is going to be involved in that cleanup for what seems to be a pretty long time?
Yeah, well, I think by saying we're not earmarking money for Flint, we're saying, look, we spent almost $200 million there already, the state. The federal government has pitched in another $100 million. So we're $300 million in. What are the impacts of $300 million? How are we measuring what the performance and what the improvement is? And I think we've come a long ways on that, especially on the filtration plant side. There's still work to be done on some of the piping, and that's going to be ongoing. I don't know what those costs are, but again, at $300 million, you got to figure out, you got to make an assessment of where you are and how much have you improved. Then you can go on from there and figure out, do you need more or less, or does it not necessarily go to operations, but needs to go to healthcare or needs to go to other things. And Senator Annick's been very, very forthright and very innovative on the things that we can do to make the most impact, and I give him a lot of credit for that.
Senator Ananick and you appear to have, obviously, difference of opinion on a lot of things, but a good working relationship. Is that as it appears?
Yeah, certainly is. He's one of my friends here.
When you look at this legislature, and I know we touched on this a little bit, but it becomes a little clearer as we move closer and closer to an election cycle. There are a whole lot of the folks that you serve with here in the Senate that are going to be gone after this next election cycle, including you. And this is my guess, not yours, but looking at the number of members in the House that will be term limited, plus those that may want to run for some of these open Senate seats, there could be 50 new members on the other end
potentially,
of this hall. What does that do? Now, I want to talk about the impact of leaving in a minute, but what does that do to a body when you're going to have potentially almost half new members down there and more than half down here, even though fairly, I should point out, many of these, if history serves as a model for the future, will have served in the House, because a lot of time House members, such as yourself, move over to the Senate.
Well, I think it's not unlike a corporation or a hospital board or something. When you get that many new people at a time, there's a level of understanding that they have coming in, having run for an office, and then there's a different level that they need to understand about governing. And a lot of times that transition takes longer for some than the other. I see, at least in my tenure here, that folks that have been in local government or some form of governing body get that a little bit sooner after they get here. But it's a learning curve, and as Congressman Heisinger told me when I got here the first time, he said, it's like drinking from the fire hose. And I know you've heard that phrase before, but it really is. There's a difference between running for office and actually governing, and doing the best you can with all the information you have.
Well, you say it in a more genteel way. I often refer to it as people show up here still believing their campaign literature. And there is a difference between that and the actual policy making.
Not from Ottawa County.
The idea is, though, that when we come back in January of 2019, all of the levers are going to be controlled by somebody else.
Correct.
And many of those people are going to have pretty limited experience, but they're still going to face the challenges that you face with budgets. They're still going to face the challenges that you face with Flint. They're still going to face the challenges that you face with those unfunded liabilities and pensions and those things that are out there. Realistically, how difficult is it for people, and again, understanding some come from the House, a lot of folks are going to be starting at ground zero. That's a whole lot to wrap around and get it right.
Yeah, it is. But again, look at the folks that came into the House this time, rapidly got there. I mean, they really did grasp right away what the enormity was of the problems and worked on solutions. And I think a new group coming in will do the same. but probably not with the background knowledge of some folks. But I hope that the citizens of Michigan put people in that have some experience. And I've said this about other issues. This job is where the public doesn't necessarily value experience, but if they want an attorney, a doctor, or their accountant, they want somebody who's had lots of experience and knows what they're doing. And this job, it doesn't seem like they value experience nearly as much as they should.
Well, and that's a result of a vote that was taken to create term limits here in the state a number of years ago, and that is the law. There's a suggestion that in addition to term limits, you should be a part-time legislature. What would that do to the decision-making process?
Well, and again, 40 some other states do some variation of part-time. Some of them are, you only do your voting a certain time, but then you're still working in your districts, and this is a wide variation of it. I would suggest that if you're going to have someone here just the first 90 days, you could really have a Speaker of the House or a leader who's only been on the job 90 days. That in the experience realm, again, seems a little difficult for internal workings and make things work right. But if you're going to go to part-time and I joke and say I am already part-time, I work any part of 80 or 90 hours a week that you want, okay? And I think you have opportunities to explain to the public how that is good and bad in the balance of the executive, the judicial, and the legislative. There's a good opportunity to explain that. But if you're going to do it, I think you should do something with term limits, either make them a little longer or eliminate them, and I'm not suggesting which one. But if in many places, take Indiana, for example, they have part-time legislature, but they don't know exactly what their term limit scheme is, but you have people that have been there 10, 12, and 14 years and can really dig into these budgets, like Senator Prose, who we just mentioned, and really can understand and go toe-to-toe with the administration and the executive and make sure that they are doing the best for the taxpayers. That's limited knowledge if you're really only here 3 90-day sessions if you're a House member. It's tough to get that.
When you are ready to start packing up all of your pictures and all of the awards in here, and you're going to be leaving with a whole bunch of people, and a lot of those people you've known for your time in the House, too. Right. You've been serving
2007.
It has to be interesting. I know you don't dwell on it because you've got stuff to do, but it's a chunk out of your life that has, I would suspect, changed immeasurably from the time you got here to ended up in this office. What's it going to be like when you're packing up?
Well, I was given great advice when I came in the House because, again, then Congressman Heising was Representative Heising right next to me, and I wore out the carpet going to his office, asking him all, what's this going on? Why is this happening? And one piece of advice he gave to me that I've been trying to do the best I can, he says, you're going to learn a lot while you're here. You're getting a PhD education at the taxpayer's expense. You need to use it to make the best decisions you can. And it's the one that stuck with me the most is if you can be relatively the same person when you leave that when you came here in your ideals and the things that you wanted to do and represent your community, you've done better than most. And that's been one of my goals, is to try to leave the same person I was when I got here. And that's not always easy every day, because when you deal with 140 other people, but at least at the end of the day, I want them to be able to say I treated them fairly. Don't always agree with them, and I think Senator Anik and I's friendship is evidence of that, and we've been trying to model that.
I should point out that the senator still has 18 months in office, and we'll talk to him a number of times between now and then. And we'll have more when we return to the point. There is so much more to talk about this week. Next week, we'll take up the conversation about that chilling shooting near Washington, D.C. with one of our federal lawmakers. Continue to keep you updated every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock right here on Wood TV for To The Point.